On November 29, 1970, a man and his two young daughters were hiking through the foothills of Mount Ulriken near Bergen, Norway. The area was known locally as Isdal, or the Valley of Death, a name earned centuries earlier when the treacherous scree slopes became a common site for hiking accidents and suicides. The father was focused on the path, guiding his children over the slick, frost-covered rocks as the afternoon light began to fail. He wanted to reach the summit and return home before the mountain air turned truly bitter. But as they rounded a jagged outcrop, the younger girl stopped and pointed toward a depression in the landscape. In the center of a small clearing, tucked between several large boulders, was a blackened patch of earth that looked out of place against the gray stone. The father assumed it was the remains of a campfire left by irresponsible campers. But as the wind shifted, he caught a scent that made his stomach turn. It was a heavy, sweet, and metallic odor that smelled nothing like wood smoke or pine. He told his daughters to stay exactly where they were and stepped forward alone to investigate. What he found among the charred rocks was a human figure so badly burned that it had begun to merge with the landscape itself. There are 10 stories in this episode, and each one involves a person who walked into a situation they believed was ordinary, only to find a hidden kind of danger waiting for them. This video has background sound for relaxation, and I would like to invite you to subscribe only if you find that this style of storytelling is something you enjoy. I am curious to know where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. In almost every case we discuss, the people closest to the danger usually realized the truth only when it was far too late to change the outcome. Before we return to the Valley of Death, please take the like button on a scenic mountain hike, and then kindly point out a shortcut that leads directly into a thicket of stinging nettles. It will appreciate the exercise and the very sudden, tingling sensation that follows. The hiker stood frozen on the slope as he looked down at the woman's body. She was lying on her back in a defensive posture, with her arms pulled up toward her chest as if she had been trying to shield her face from an intense heat. Her clothes had been almost entirely consumed by fire, leaving behind only the melted remnants of synthetic fabric that had fused to her skin. He noticed that several items had been placed in a deliberate, almost ritualistic circle around her. There was a plastic water bottle, a pair of rubber boots, and a few pieces of jewelry that glinted in the dim sunlight. The wind whipped across the ridge, biting into the hiker's exposed skin and carrying the sharp scent of gasoline that still clung to the damp earth. He looked back at his daughters, who were huddled together a few yards away, and he felt a cold weight settle in the pit of his stomach as he realized he had brought them into a crime scene. He needed to get them away from this place. But the silence of the valley suddenly felt heavy and watchful, as if the person who had set the fire might still be crouching somewhere in the shadows of the rocks. I should never have taken this trail today, he thought, and he grabbed his children's hands to begin the frantic descent back toward the city. When the Bergen police arrived on the scene the following morning, they found the environment even more disturbing than the hiker had described. The woman's face had been burned beyond recognition, making a visual identification impossible. As the forensics team began to process the site, they noticed a strange detail about the items left behind. The labels had been carefully cut out of her clothing, and the brand names had been scraped off her water bottle and her rubber boots. It was as if someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that nothing she carried could be traced back to a specific store or country. An autopsy revealed that the woman had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and the ingestion of at least 50 sleeping pills. There were also traces of gasoline in the soil beneath her, confirming that she had been alive when the fire was started. The lead investigator, a man named Nils Jarle Gjerd, struggled to reconcile the evidence of suicide with the sheer clinical effort taken to erase her identity. People who take their own lives usually leave notes or keep their identification close by so their families can be notified. This woman had done the exact opposite. The investigation eventually led the police to the Bergen railway station, where they found 2 unclaimed suitcases in a luggage locker. Inside the bags, they discovered several wigs, various pairs of non-prescription glasses, and a collection of silver spoons from a hotel in Germany. Most importantly, they found a small black notebook filled with rows of handwritten numbers and letter combinations. It looked like a diary, but it was written in a language that none of the investigators could recognize. It was a code, and it was the first real evidence that the woman in the valley was not a simple tourist. As the police worked to crack the code, they began checking hotel registries across Norway using the woman's physical description. They discovered that she had stayed at several high-end hotels under at least 8 different aliases, including names like Genevieve Cartier and Claudia Tielt. Each time she checked in, she claimed to be a traveling antique dealer or a designer from Belgium. Witnesses at the hotels remembered her as a striking woman who spoke broken English and German, and who always seemed to be wearing a different wig. One hotel maid recalled seeing the woman in her room, sitting at a desk and staring at the wall while she gripped a telephone receiver. She wasn't speaking into the phone, she was just listening to the silence on the other end. Another witness remembered seeing her dining with a mysterious man at a restaurant in Bergen, but when the police tried to track him down, he had seemingly vanished from the city. The investigation was widening, but the more information the police gathered, the less they seemed to know about who the woman actually was. Cryptographers eventually managed to break the code in the black notebook. It turned out to be a detailed record of the woman's travels across Europe, including dates, locations, and durations of stay. When the police overlaid her travel schedule with secret military tests being conducted in Norway at the time, they found a chilling correlation. Every time the Norwegian military tested the new Penguin missile system in the northern fjords, the Isdal Woman was documented as being in a nearby town. She was not a designer or an antique dealer. She was an intelligence operative moving through the country under the cover of the Cold War. Despite this breakthrough, the Norwegian authorities were hesitant to label the case as an espionage-related murder. The official report concluded that the woman had committed suicide in the valley, likely due to a mental health crisis. They claimed she had meticulously cut the labels from her clothes as a symptom of her paranoia, but the public found this explanation impossible to believe. A woman who had the resources and training to maintain 8 fake identities across international borders was not a typical victim of a breakdown. The investigation hit a final, insurmountable wall when the police tried to trace her origins through her dental work. She had several gold fillings and bridges that were of a high quality, suggesting she had received dental care in a major European city. They sent her dental records to Interpol and checked with clinics across the continent, but no one came forward to claim her. It was as if she had been manufactured specifically for her mission and then deleted when that mission was compromised. In the late 1970s, the case was officially closed, and the Isdal Woman was buried in an unmarked grave in a zinc coffin. The coffin was chosen specifically so that her body would not decompose, in the hope that future technology might one day be able to identify her. The police held a small ceremony attended by only a few officers, and her belongings were eventually destroyed or placed in deep storage. The Valley of Death returned to its natural state, a quiet place of gray stone and biting wind, but the mystery of the woman who burned there remained. Decades later, in the year 26, modern forensic scientists used isotope testing on the woman's teeth to determine where she had spent her childhood. The results indicated that she was likely born in the border region between France and Germany around 1930. This narrowed the search, but it did not provide a name. Even with the most advanced technology of the 21st century, the woman in the zinc coffin remains a ghost. She was a professional who understood that in her world, the only way to stay safe was to never truly exist at all. The Isdal Woman died in a place that already carried the weight of a dark history, and her presence there only added another layer of shadow to the landscape. The items left in that deliberate circle were not just clues. They were the final remnants of a life lived in the margins of global power. Some secrets are carried to the grave, and others are burned into the very earth beneath them. As the investigation into her life faded into legend, the focus of the world shifted away from the frozen mountains of Norway toward other silent places where the truth was being hidden. Far away from the jagged peaks of Bergen, another family was living a life that seemed perfectly insulated from the dangers of the world. They lived on a quiet dairy farm in New Zealand, where the rhythm of the seasons dictated the flow of their days. They had no reason to believe that their own home was about to become the site of a mystery that would haunt their country for the next 50 years. But in the quiet rural landscape of Pukekohe, a different kind of darkness was waiting to settle over a farmhouse that should have been safe. On the morning of June 22nd, 1970, Owen Priest pulled his truck onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 22 in the rural district of Pukekohe. The air was thick with the damp, gray chill of a New Zealand winter, and the rolling green hills were partially obscured by a low-hanging mist. Owen was a practical man, a farmer who understood the rigid demands of the land and the predictable schedules of his neighbors. He looked toward the Crewe farmhouse, a sturdy wooden structure set back from the road, and noticed that the lights were still burning in the kitchen window. The farmhouse belonged to Harvey and Jeanette Crewe, a young couple who were well regarded in the tight-knit dairy community. Harvey was 28, a hard-working man who took pride in his livestock and the maintenance of his property. Jeanette was 30, a devoted mother who managed the household and cared for their 18-month-old daughter, Rochelle. Their lives were defined by the steady rotation of milking, feeding, and the quiet domesticity of a family just beginning their journey together. Owen had been passing the property for several days and had noticed a series of small, nagging inconsistencies that didn't fit the crew's usual routine. The cows had not been moved to fresh pasture, and the tractor remained parked in the same spot near the barn since the previous Wednesday. Most troubling of all was the fact that the lights stayed on through the day and night, cutting through the darkness of the rural landscape like a beacon. He had assumed they were perhaps away visiting family, but the lack of movement on the farm began to feel like a heavy, unanswered question. Daily life in Pukekohe was usually a matter of shared labor and local gossip, where everyone knew when a neighbor was struggling or when a new calf was born. The Crews were not the type of people to leave their responsibilities untended without a word to anyone. Harvey had recently been preoccupied with the seasonal transition of his herd, a task that required constant attention and physical presence. Jeanette was known for her punctuality and her habit of hanging the laundry out to dry as soon as the morning frost lifted from the grass. Owen decided to walk up the long driveway, his boots crunching on the wet gravel as he approached the back entrance of the house. He called out for Harvey, but the only response was the distant, lonely lowing of a cow that had gone too long without being milked. The farmhouse sat in a pocket of unnatural stillness that seemed to repel the ordinary sounds of the countryside. He noticed that the back door was slightly ajar, which was unusual given the biting cold of the June wind. He reached out and felt the cold, smooth metal of the brass doorknob against his palm as he pushed the door open. The interior of the kitchen was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single overhead light that had been left burning for days. A thick, sweet, and metallic scent hung in the stagnant air, mingling with the smell of souring milk left in a bowl on the counter. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the silence in the house was not empty, but heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I need to find the baby before I find whatever made that smell, he thought, and he forced himself to step across the threshold into the gloom. Owen moved through the kitchen and stopped when he saw the floor. A massive, dark stain had spread across the linoleum, dried into a deep mahogany crust that reached from the table to the hallway. There were smaller spatters on the cupboards and a single, bloody handprint smeared against the white paint of the doorframe. He didn't see Harvey or Jeanette, but he saw their absence in the half-finished meal, still sitting on the table, and the abandoned knitting left on the sofa. He followed a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the back of the house, a soft whimpering that grew louder as he approached the nursery. He pushed the bedroom door open and saw 18-month-old Rochelle lying in her crib. She was pale and visibly dehydrated, her eyes sunken and her voice reduced to a thin, rasping cry. She was alive, but she was alone in a house that had become a tomb for the life her parents had built. Owen scooped the child up and ran from the house, driving her immediately to a local doctor before alerting the authorities. When the police arrived at the Crewe farm, they found a scene that defied simple logic. There were no signs of a forced entry and no indication that anything of value had been stolen from the property. The blood on the floor was enough to confirm that both Harvey and Jeanette had suffered catastrophic injuries, yet their bodies were nowhere to be found. The investigation was led by Detective Bruce Hutton, who faced immediate pressure from a public horrified by the thought of a killer haunting the rural landscape. Officers combed through the surrounding paddocks and outbuildings, looking for any sign of a struggle or a burial site. They found a blood-stained knitted baby booty tucked into a corner of the house, a small and tragic reminder of the violence that had interrupted a normal evening. The search eventually moved toward the Waikato River, a deep and fast-moving waterway that snaked through the region. In August, nearly 2 months after the disappearance, Jeanette's body was recovered from the river, followed by Harvey's a few weeks later. Both had been shot in the head with a small-caliber firearm, and their bodies had been weighted down with heavy iron axle parts from a vehicle. The precision of the disposal suggested that the killer was someone familiar with the local geography and the mechanics of farm equipment. The community's suspicion quickly turned toward the neighbors and local landowners. The police focused their attention on a local farmer named Arthur Allen Thomas, who lived on a property just a few miles from the Crews. Thomas had once been a suitor of Jeanette's before she married Harvey, providing the investigators with a possible motive of jealousy. When they searched his farm, they found a rifle that matched the caliber used in the murders. However, a forensic sweep of the Crewe garden had initially turned up nothing, only for a shell casing to miraculously appear in a flower bed months later during a second search. This shell casing became the primary piece of evidence used to convict Arthur Allen Thomas of the double murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and for a time, the authorities claimed that justice had been served for the Crewe family. But the case refused to stay settled, as local journalists and legal experts began to point out massive inconsistencies in the police's version of events. The shell casing found in the garden did not match the ammunition Thomas actually owned, and the timeline of the second search was highly suspicious. The most disturbing question, however, remained unanswered throughout the trial. If Harvey and Jeanette had been killed on the night they vanished, how did Rochelle survive for 5 days alone in the house? A child of her age could not have fed herself or climbed out of her crib to find water. Forensic experts testified that she showed signs of having been cared for during the period her parents were missing. Someone had to have entered that blood-stained house, walked past the bodies, and fed the infant before disappearing back into the night. Arthur Allen Thomas spent 9 years in prison, maintaining his innocence and insisting that he had been framed by the very people sworn to protect the community. His case eventually reached the highest levels of government, leading to a royal commission of inquiry. The investigation concluded that Detective Bruce Hutton and another officer had planted the shell casing at the Crewe property to secure a conviction. It was one of the most significant cases of police corruption in the history of the country. Thomas was granted a full pardon and released from prison, but the exoneration did nothing to solve the original mystery. The police never identified another suspect, and the files on the Crewe murders remained cold. The identity of the person who fed Rochelle while her parents lay dead in the river was never discovered. Some believed it was the killer returning out of a warped sense of mercy, while others thought a local witness was too terrified to come forward with what they had seen. Today, the Crewe farmhouse still stands in Pukekohe, though it has passed through several owners who have tried to scrub away the memory of that June night. Rochelle grew up and eventually sought her own answers, but the passage of time had eroded the trail of evidence. The case remains a permanent scar on the New Zealand justice system, a reminder that the truth can be buried just as deeply as a secret in a fast-moving river. Arthur Allen Thomas lived out the rest of his life as a free man, but but he was never able to reclaim the decade he lost to a lie. The police officers involved in the framing were never prosecuted for their roles in the investigation, leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust in the Waikato region. The final files on the case are held in a secure archive, containing the photographs of a blood-stained kitchen and a single, empty crib. The house was silent, but it was not empty. The small details of a life interrupted remained behind. From the half-knitted sweater to the rust on the axle parts that took the cruise to the bottom of the river, the darkness that settled over Pukekohe was not the work of a stranger from a distant land, but something that grew from the very soil of the community itself. When the law finally stopped looking for a scapegoat, they found that they were standing in the middle of a mystery they no longer had the will to solve. The heavy silence of the New Zealand countryside eventually gave way to the humid, crowded atmosphere of a different hemisphere. While the crews were being betrayed by the people meant to find their killer, a young girl in Brazil was walking into a trap set by those who believed their status made them untouchable. The coastal air of Vitória carried the scent of salt and growth, but beneath the surface of the growing city, a much more volatile kind of corruption was preparing to strike. On the afternoon of May 18, 1973, Lola Cabrera sat in the kitchen of her home in Vitória, Brazil, listening to the rhythmic hum of a pedestal fan pushing the humid Atlantic air around the room. It was a Friday, and the city was beginning to vibrate with the restless energy of the coming weekend. Lola was a woman of routine, and her day was built around the precise timing of the local bus schedule. She glanced at the clock on the wall, noting that it was nearly 3 o'clock, the time her 8-year-old daughter, Araceli, usually arrived home from school. Araceli was a bright, energetic child with a shock of dark hair and a smile that seemed to light up the modest neighborhood. That morning, she had dressed in her favorite school uniform, a vibrant yellow cotton dress that stood out against the gray concrete of the city streets. She had kissed her mother goodbye and headed toward the St. Bernadette school, carrying a small satchel filled with her notebooks. To Lola, the yellow dress was a symbol of her daughter's innocence and the bright future the family was working so hard to build in the growing coastal capital. The city of Vitória was a place of stark contrasts, where modern high-rise apartments looked down over narrow, winding alleys and crowded marketplaces. The smell of salt water and roasting coffee often mingled with the scent of diesel exhaust from the heavy traffic. Lola found comfort in these familiar sensations, believing that the busy, public nature of the city provided a layer of safety for her children. She began to prepare a light afternoon snack, setting out a plate of sliced fruit and a glass of water on the wooden kitchen table. Ordinary life for the Cabrera family was defined by a constant struggle to balance work with the responsibilities of a young family. Lola's husband, Gabriel, worked long hours, and much of the daily household management fell to her. She moved between the sink and the table, her mind already drifting toward the evening chores and the grocery list for the next day. The sound of a heavy diesel engine signaled the arrival of the afternoon bus at the corner stop just a few houses away. Lola stepped onto the small front porch and shielded her eyes from the bright, tropical sun as the bus lurched to a halt. The folding doors hissed open, and a small group of workers and students stepped onto the pavement, their voices rising in a brief flurry of conversation. She waited for the flash of yellow that would indicate Araceli had made the journey home safely. But as the bus pulled away and the dust settled, the sidewalk remained empty of the person she was looking for. She walked down to the corner and spoke to the driver, a man she recognized from the daily route. He wiped sweat from his forehead and confirmed that he remembered seeing a young girl in a bright yellow dress boarding the bus near the school. However, he told Lola that she had requested to get off several stops early, in a part of the city that was far from her home. Lola felt a slight flicker of confusion, as Araceli was a child of habit who never deviated from her path without permission. Initially, Lola tried to convince herself that there was a simple explanation for the delay. She thought perhaps Araceli had gone to a friend's house to finish a school project, or had been distracted by a shop window along the way. She walked the few blocks to the school, her footsteps quickening as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the street. The heat of the pavement radiated through the soles of her shoes, and the salt air felt increasingly thick and difficult to breathe. When she reached the school gates, she found the building nearly deserted, save for a janitor sweeping the main hallway. He informed her that the classes had ended early that day for a faculty meeting, and most of the children had left hours before. This was the first detail that felt truly wrong, as Araceli had not mentioned any change in the schedule. Lola stood in the empty courtyard, the silence of the school echoing the growing hollow sensation in her chest. She returned home and called her husband, her voice trembling as she explained that their daughter had vanished somewhere between the school and the bus stop. Gabriel left work immediately, and together they began a frantic search of the surrounding neighborhoods, knocking on doors and showing a photograph of Araceli to anyone who would stop. By nightfall, the yellow dress had become a ghost, a fragment of memory that no one in the bustling city could seem to pin down. The point of no return arrived later that evening when a stranger called the house and claimed to have Araceli. The voice on the other end was cold and detached, demanding a ransom that was far beyond the family's modest means. Lola gripped the receiver so hard her knuckles turned white, listening to the man read from what sounded like a scripted list of instructions. But as the call went on, she realized the person didn't know the name of Araceli's favorite doll or the color of her bedroom. It was a cruel opportunist feeding on their desperation, and it meant that the real threat was still unknown. For the next 6 days, the Cabrera home became a center of agonizing silence, broken only by the ringing of the telephone and the arrival of police officers who seemed more interested in the family's background than the search for the girl. Lola sat by the window, watching the street for any sign of a bright yellow dress. The police were slow to act, citing a lack of resources and suggesting that the girl might have simply run away. The local media picked up the story, and the image of the missing girl in the yellow dress began to appear on the front pages of the national newspapers. On the morning of the 6th day, a group of workers clearing brush behind a local hospital noticed a flock of vultures circling a thicket of overgrown weeds. Lola stood behind a line of yellow police tape, the grit of the dry earth beneath her feet feeling like sandpaper against her skin. The air was heavy with the acrid, chemical sting of industrial acid that seemed to burn the back of her throat and drown out the scent of the nearby ocean. A detective walked toward her with a somber expression, and she realized with a jolt of primal terror that the person they had found was no longer wearing a yellow dress. "My little girl is trapped in that smell," she thought, and the world around her suddenly felt as though it were collapsing into a single, dark point. The discovery was more horrific than anyone had imagined. The body had been subjected to an unspeakable level of violence and then doused in acid to prevent a quick identification. Despite the damage, a few fragments of yellow fabric remained, confirming that the search for a missing child had become a murder investigation. The location of the body, tucked behind a prominent hospital in a wealthy part of the city, suggested that the killers were not worried about being seen. As the investigation slowly gained momentum, witnesses began to emerge with information that the police had previously ignored. Several people reported seeing a group of young men in a luxury car near the school on the day Araceli disappeared. These were not the kind of men who usually frequented the working-class neighborhoods. They were the sons of the city's elite, young men from families with deep political connections and immense wealth. The investigation centered on 2 primary suspects, Dante Michelini and Paulo Hilao. They were part of a group known for throwing wild, drug-fueled parties at private beach houses along the coast. It was alleged that Araceli had been abducted to be used as a form of entertainment for the group, a child taken by men who believed their status made them untouchable. The details of the crime suggested a level of depravity that shocked the entire nation of Brazil. The case against the young men seemed strong, with physical evidence and witness statements placing them in the vicinity of the abduction and the hospital. However, As the trial approached, the legal system began to show signs of a deep-seated rot. Evidence that had been meticulously gathered by the initial investigators started to disappear from police lockers. Witnesses who had been vocal about what they saw suddenly moved away or developed convenient lapses in memory. The most chilling moment of the investigation came when a local man who had been arrested for a minor crime claimed to have information about the Acid Man, the individual who had allegedly helped the boys dispose of the body. He was scheduled to testify before a judge, a move that could have broken the case wide open. But before he could take the stand, he was found dead in his prison cell. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the bruises on his neck told a very different story. Despite the public outcry and the mountains of circumstantial evidence, the trial of Dante Michelini and Paolo Helal ended in a stunning acquittal. The judge ruled that the prosecution had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, citing the lack of direct physical evidence and the inconsistent testimony of the remaining witnesses. To the people of Vitória, it was a clear message that the law was not a shield for the weak, but a sword for the powerful. Lola and Gabriel were left to watch as the men they believed had murdered their daughter walked out of the courtroom as free citizens. The injustice of the verdict sparked riots in the streets and led to a national movement demanding better protection for children. The yellow dress that Araceli had worn on her last day became a symbol of a life stolen and a system that had failed to provide even the most basic form of accountability. In the years that followed, the date of Araceli's disappearance, May 18, was officially designated as Brazil's National Day to combat the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. It was a hollow victory for a mother who still sat in her kitchen, listening to the hum of the fan and waiting for a bus that would never bring her daughter home. The men accused of the crime moved on with their lives, their names protected by the very institutions that should have held them responsible. The final verdict of the case remains legally closed, and under Brazilian law, no one can be tried again for the crime. The files are kept in a government archive, a testament to a period of history where the influence of a few outweighed the lives of the many. The case of the century ended not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a courtroom door. The yellow dress was never returned to the family. It remains somewhere in a box of evidence. A fading piece of cotton that once belonged to a girl who only wanted to go home after school. The salt air of Vitória still carries the scent of the ocean. But for those who remember 1973, it also carries the faint, ghostly sting of a truth that was burned away. The memory of the girl in the yellow dress eventually became a permanent part of the city's identity, a warning of what happens when corruption is allowed to flourish. As the sun set over the coast of Brazil, another kind of predator was preparing to strike in a very different part of the world. In the ancient, rolling hills of Italy, a shadowy figure was watching from the darkness of a vineyard, waiting for the perfect moment to interrupt a quiet evening. Saturday night, September 14, 1974. Pasquale Gentilcore steered his blue Fiat 124 onto a narrow dirt path near the town of Borgo San Lorenzo. The headlights cut through the thick, dry grass of the Mugello Valley, illuminating the twisted trunks of ancient olive trees. Pasquale was 19 years old and worked as a barman at a local cafe, a job that required long hours and a constant smile for the regulars. Tonight, the only person he wanted to see was sitting in the passenger seat next to him. Stefania Pettini was 18 and possessed a quiet, thoughtful energy that Pasquale found magnetic. She worked as a clerk and lived under the watchful eyes of her traditional parents, which made their private time together both precious and rare. They had spent the earlier part of the evening at a local disco, dancing to the muffled thud of pop music before the heat and the crowds became too much to bear. The interior of the Fiat was small and cramped, but to Pasquale, it felt like the only private world they had ever truly owned. He killed the engine and the headlights, plunging the car into the deep, velvet darkness of the Tuscan countryside. The air was heavy with the scent of ripening grapes from the nearby vineyards and the sharp, dusty smell of sun-baked earth. For a few moments, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the cooling engine and the steady, frantic chirping of crickets in the tall grass. Pasquale rolled down his window just enough to catch the faint breeze that carried the coolness of the approaching autumn night. Ordinary life in the province of Florence moved at a slow pace that hadn't changed much in 100 years. Families gathered for long Sunday lunches, and young men like Pasquale were expected to work hard, save money, and eventually marry a local girl. He felt the weight of those expectations every day at the bar, serving espresso to men who had sat in the same chairs for decades. But out here, away from the street lights and the prying eyes of the village elders, he felt a fleeting sense of freedom. He had planned this evening carefully, choosing a spot that was secluded enough to avoid the carabinieri patrols, but accessible enough for his small car to navigate. He knew that dozens of other couples were likely parked in similar clearings across the hills, all seeking the same brief escape from the rigid social structures of their town. It was a common ritual, an accepted but unspoken part of being young in rural Italy. Pasquale reached across the gear shift and took Stefania's hand, feeling the slight dampness of her palm in the humid air. He noticed that the crickets in the grass immediately surrounding the car had suddenly gone silent. It was a small detail, a minor break in the wall of sound that usually filled the valley at night, but it made the hair on his neck stand up. He listened intently, expecting to hear the heavy footfalls of a stray cow, or perhaps the rustle of a wild boar moving through the brush. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and unnatural, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath in anticipation of a strike. A shadow moved across the hood of the car, blocking the faint silver light of the moon for a fraction of a second. Pasquale leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, but the darkness was absolute and the glass was beginning to fog from their breath. He told himself it was just a trick of the light or a low-hanging branch swaying in the wind. He didn't want to alarm Stefania, so he kept his voice low and steady, making a small joke about the ghosts of the valley to break the tension. The vinyl of the seat stuck to the skin of his back as he shifted his weight, the heat in the cabin becoming stifling and thick. A sudden, sharp rap on the driver's side window made him jump, and he turned to see a pale, distorted face pressed against the glass. The pressure of the situation tightened around his chest like a physical vice when he realized the figure was holding a heavy, dark object level with his head. He's not here for the wallet, Pasquale thought, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow just as the glass began to shatter. The following morning, a local farmer named Pietro was walking along the edge of his vineyard when he noticed a blue Fiat parked in the middle of a clearing. The car looked out of place, abandoned in a way that suggested the occupants had left in a hurry or were unable to return. He approached the vehicle cautiously, calling out a greeting that went unanswered in the still morning air. As he got closer, he saw that the driver's side window had been blown inward, leaving a sparkling carpet of glass on the dirt. Inside the car, Pasquale Gentilcore was slumped against the steering wheel, his life having ended in a flurry of gunfire before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt. Stefania was gone, and the passenger door stood wide open, revealing a trail of flattened grass leading away into the vineyard. The farmer didn't wait to see more. He ran back toward the main road, his shouts for help echoing through the quiet valley. The peace of Borgo San Lorenzo was broken, replaced by a cold, clinical horror that would soon spread across the entire province. When the investigators arrived, they found that the scene was not a simple robbery or a random act of violence. Pasquale had been shot several times with a .22 caliber pistol, a weapon that left behind small, distinctive brass shell casings stamped with the letter H. There was no evidence that the killer had searched his pockets or tried to take the car. The attack had been precise, fast, and focused entirely on the destruction of the young man behind the wheel. The search for Stefania ended a few hundred yards away in the tall grass near a row of grapevines. Her body had been subjected to a level of violence that shocked even the most veteran officers on the Florence police force. She had been stabbed 96 times. A frenzied explosion of rage that indicated the killer had spent a significant amount of time at the scene after the initial shooting. Most disturbing of all was the way her body had been positioned, arranged in a ritualistic display that suggested a deep, pathological hatred. Lead investigator Ruggero Perugini noted that the killer had shown a terrifying ability to approach a silent car in the pitch black without being detected. This wasn't the work of a disorganized drifter or a panicked thief. It was the work of a voyeur. Someone who spent their nights stalking the hills and watching couples from the shadows until the urge to intervene became overwhelming. The community began to whisper about a monster hiding in the hills, a shadow that knew their secrets and waited for them in the dark. The investigation initially focused on local men with histories of violence or sexual deviance. They questioned hunters, farmers, and even local clergy, looking for anyone who possessed a .22 caliber Beretta. The ballistic evidence was the only concrete link they had. But in a region where hunting was a way of life, thousands of people owned similar firearms. The police were looking for a needle in a haystack of olive groves and vineyards. A breakthrough seemed to arrive when a detective uncovered a forgotten file from 1968. In that case, a woman and her lover had been murdered in a car while her young son slept in the back seat. The ballistic reports from 6 years earlier were an exact match for the shell casings found at the Gentilcore scene. The same gun had been used, and the same ritualistic elements were present, suggesting that the monster had been active much longer than anyone had realized. The 1968 case had resulted in the conviction of the woman's husband, Stefano Mele, who was currently serving time in prison. This created a massive logical problem for the investigators. If the killer was behind bars, how could he have committed the 1974 murders? They began to suspect that Mele had not acted alone, or that the true killer was someone within his inner circle who had kept the gun and waited years to strike again. The investigation eventually led to a group of local men who were nicknamed the Picnic Snatchers. These were social outcasts and farm laborers who were known to spend their weekends drinking wine and spying on couples in the lovers' lanes. One of them was Pietro Pacciani, a man with a history of extreme violence and a deep resentment toward the younger generation. Pacciani became the primary face of the Monster of Florence investigation. But the evidence against him was largely circumstantial and based on the testimony of unreliable witnesses. Despite the arrests and the sensational trials that followed, the shell casings continued to appear at new crime scenes throughout the 1970s and 80s. Each time the police thought they had caught the monster, another couple was found murdered in a secluded clearing. The killer seemed to be mocking the authorities, moving through the darkness with a ghostly precision that evaded every stakeout and every forensic trap. He was a shadow that could not be pinned down by ordinary law enforcement methods. The case of Pasquale and Stefania remains the cornerstone of the monster's legacy because it established the signature that would haunt Italy for decades. It wasn't just about the murder, it was about the interruption of intimacy. The killer wanted to destroy the very idea of young love, turning the beautiful landscapes of Tuscany into a map of fear. To this day, the people of Borgo San Lorenzo remember the night the crickets went silent and the vineyards became a graveyard. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, involving occult theories, accusations of secret societies, and multiple wrongful arrests. Pietro Pacciani died before his final appeal could be heard, and many believe the true monster was never actually caught. The case remains a patchwork of fragmented evidence and broken lives, a mystery that has never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of the victims' families. The blue Fiat was eventually crushed, but the memory of what happened inside it lingers. The final status of the 1974 case is technically unsolved, as the specific links between the suspects and the Gentilcore scene were never proven in a way that could survive the scrutiny of the highest courts. The Mugello Valley is still a place of incredible beauty, where the sun sets over the vineyards in a wash of gold and purple. But for those who know the history of the hills, the beauty is always tempered by the knowledge of what the darkness can hide. Pasquale and Stefania were buried in their respective family plots, their lives reduced to a set of statistics in a cold police file. The vineyards continued to produce grapes, and the cars still park in the secluded clearings. But the carefree nature of the Italian night has been permanently altered. The Monster of Florence became a myth, a dark fairy tale used to warn the young about the dangers of wandering too far from the light. The hills of Tuscany are beautiful, but they have a very long memory for blood. The silence of the night is no longer a comfort, but a reminder that someone might be watching from the shadows of the olive trees. As the memory of the 1974 murders began to fade into the broader history of the region, the focus of the world's mysteries moved across the ocean to a different kind of public space. In the city of Adelaide, Australia, the danger was not hiding in a dark vineyard, but in the middle of a massive, roaring crowd. Thousands of people were gathered to celebrate a national pastime, unaware that two children were about to walk out of a stadium and into a void that no amount of searching could fill. The transition from the private dark of Italy to the public glare of South Australia revealed that the most dangerous predators do not always need to hide in the shadows. Saturday afternoon, August 25, 1973. Joanne Ratcliffe sat on a hard wooden bench in the grandstand of the Adelaide Oval. The winter sun was bright but lacked any real warmth, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured green grass of the playing field. Joanne was 11 years old, a responsible girl who was more interested in the excited energy of the crowd than the specific strategy of the Australian rules football match unfolding below. She adjusted her cardigan and looked down at 4-year-old Kirsta Gordon, who was sitting restlessly beside her. The stadium was packed with nearly 30,000 people, a sea of wool coats and team scarves that hummed with a constant, low-frequency roar. The air was thick with the scent of hot meat pies, spilled beer, and the faint, earthy smell of the turf. Joanne could feel the vibration of the crowd's cheers through the soles of her shoes every time a goal was kicked. It was a day of predictable, communal joy, a midwinter ritual that felt as solid and safe as the stone walls of the Oval itself. Joanne was the kind of girl people described as an old soul, always mindful of the rules and the needs of those younger than her. She had been looking forward to this outing for weeks, enjoying the rare treat of a big stadium event with her family. Her parents, Les and Kathleen, trusted her implicitly, knowing she would never wander off or take unnecessary risks. To Joanne, being given the responsibility of sitting with Kirsta was a badge of maturity she wore with pride. Kirsta Gordon was a whirlwind of blonde hair and 4-year-old curiosity, barely able to sit still as the game grew more intense. She wore a bright blue coat that made her easy to spot in a crowd, and she spent much of the match asking Joanne questions about the players. The two girls were not sisters, but their families were so close they might as well have been. They shared snacks and whispered secrets, oblivious to the thousands of strangers surrounding them in the concrete bowl of the stadium. The Ratcliffe and Gordon families had picked a spot in the grandstand that offered a clear view of the field but remained close to the exits and amenities. They were surrounded by regulars, people who attended every home game and shared a sense of quiet, suburban familiarity. Ordinary life in Adelaide in the early 70s was defined by this kind of trust, where children were often given the freedom to navigate public spaces on their own. It was a world where a crowded stadium felt like a protective village. As the match reached the three-quarter-time break, the tension on the field began to spike as North Adelaide and Central District battled for the lead. The crowd grew louder, more animated, and the space between the rows of seats became a chaotic flow of people heading for the restrooms or the pie heaters. Joanne watched the players trot toward their huddles, her mind momentarily focused on the scoreboard. She felt a tug on her sleeve and looked down to see Kirsta shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Kirsta whispered that she needed to go to the bathroom, her small face pinched with the urgency of the request. Joanne checked with her father, who was leaning forward to catch the latest stats from a neighbor. Les glanced at the girls, Then at the restroom entrance, visible just a short distance away, under the stands. He gave Joanne a quick nod and told them to be fast. As the final quarter was about to begin, Joanne took Kirste by the hand and stood up, smoothing her skirt before stepping into the aisle. They moved through the labyrinth of legs and discarded programs, Joanne leading the way with a firm, practiced grip on Kirste's fingers. The transition from the open sunlight of the grandstand to the concrete shadows of the concourse was immediate and cooling. The air here was damp, smelling of old tobacco smoke and the metallic scent of the heavy plumbing. Joanne kept her eyes fixed on the ladies' room sign, navigating the thinned-out crowd of spectators who were rushing to finish their cigarettes. Near the archway of Exit 6, which led out toward the trees and parklands surrounding the stadium, Joanne saw a man standing alone. He was leaning against a brick pillar, wearing a dark felt hat pulled low in a heavy sense, gray overcoat that seemed out of place for the afternoon. He wasn't watching the game or the people passing by. He was simply there, a still point in a moving landscape. As they walked past, Joanne felt a strange, cold prickle of unease, but she quickly dismissed it as a silly thought. The ladies' room was a frantic hub of activity, filled with the sound of rushing water and the echoes of women discussing the game. Joanne waited by the large, industrial sinks, watching the door of the stall Kirste had entered. She looked at her reflection in the spotted mirror, noticing the way her own eyes looked slightly tired in the harsh fluorescent light. She felt a sudden, sharp desire to be back in the grandstand, away from the cold concrete and the smell of bleach. When they exited the restroom, the concourse had become eerily quiet. Most of the spectators had returned to their seats for the final siren, leaving the wide concrete spaces feeling vast and exposed. The man in the hat was no longer leaning against the pillar. Joanne turned toward the grandstand entrance, but Kirste suddenly stopped, her attention caught by a small, colorful bird that had hopped onto the ground near the open gate of Exit 6. The bird fluttered toward the parklands, and Kirste let go of Joanne's hand to follow it for just a few steps. Joanne called out to her, her voice sounding small and thin against the rising roar of the crowd inside the stadium. She stepped toward the gate, intending to scoop the younger girl up and head back to their parents. But as she reached the threshold of the stadium, a shadow fell across the pavement, blocking the low afternoon sun. The concrete beneath Joanne's feet felt freezing and rough, vibrating with the sudden, unified roar of 30,000 people screaming as the ball was bounced for the final quarter. The stadium gates loomed like open jaws just a few feet away, and the man in the hat was suddenly standing right in their path, his heavy coat brushing against her arm. He reached down toward Kirste with a slow, practiced grace, and Joanne felt a cold spike of panic as she realized that the crowd was now just a wall of noise that couldn't hear her. I have to stay with her or she will be all alone, she thought, and she reached out to grab Kirste's coat as the man began to move toward the exit. A witness standing near the outer fence later recalled seeing a man walking toward the parklands with a young child in a blue coat. The man appeared calm, as if he were simply taking his daughter for a walk away from the noise of the game. Behind him, an older girl was following closely, her head down and her posture suggesting she was in distress. The witness assumed it was a family matter, perhaps a father dealing with a difficult afternoon, and they turned back to watch the final minutes of the match. Back in the grandstand, Les Ratcliffe was no longer looking at the scoreboard. He stood up and scanned the concourse through the gaps in the seating, his heart beginning to thud with a heavy, rhythmic dread. The game was in full swing, the siren only minutes away, and the girls had been gone far longer than a simple trip to the bathroom required. He nudged Kirste's father and told him they needed to go find them, his voice tight with a realization that was arriving too late. The two fathers ran to the restrooms, pushing through the few people remaining in the concourse. They found the ladies' room empty and the area around Exit 6 deserted save for a few discarded drink cups rolling in the wind. Les felt a wave of nausea hit him as he looked out at the vast, green parklands surrounding the oval. There were hundreds of trees, dozens of paths, and 30,000 people about to pour out of the gates and erase any footprints that might have been left behind. The police arrived at the stadium before the final siren had even finished sounding. They immediately cordoned off the exits and began a systematic search of every room, locker, and maintenance tunnel in the facility. Officers moved with flashlights through the dark spaces beneath the grandstands, their boots echoing on the concrete. They found a single white sandal half buried in the grass near the outer fence, but the girls who had been wearing them were gone. In the days that followed, the man in the hat became a figure of national obsession. Based on witness accounts, the police released a sketch of a man with a thin face and a calm expression, a face that seemed both distinctive and completely unmemorable. They received thousands of tips from people who claimed to have seen him at railway stations, parks, and bus stops. But the man in the hat proved to be a phantom, a predator who knew exactly how to use the chaos of a crowd to hide his movements. The investigation explored every possible lead, from local drifters to the family's own social circles. They looked into the family murders that had horrified Adelaide during the same era, wondering if Joanne and Kirsty had been targeted by the same group of men. Bevan Spencer von Einem, a man later convicted of a brutal murder in the city, was a primary person of interest. He was known to frequent public spaces looking for victims, but the physical evidence needed to link him to the Adelaide Oval was non-existent. For decades, the mystery of the disappearance remained a permanent wound in the heart of the city. Forensic technology advanced, and investigators used new isotope testing and DNA analysis on items found at the scene, but no breakthroughs occurred. The theory that the girls were taken by a local predator who was never caught became the most widely accepted explanation. To the people of Adelaide, the case was a reminder that the most horrific things can happen in the most public places. The Ratcliffe and Gordon families never gave up their search, even as the years turned into decades. They worked with private investigators and appeared on television specials, their faces lined with a grief that never faded. Joanne's father often returned to the Oval, standing near Exit 6 and looking out at the parklands. He lived with the agonizing memory of that final nod, the moment he gave his daughter permission to walk away into the crowd. In the year 26, the case remains one of Australia's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The Adelaide Oval has been rebuilt into a state-of-the-art arena, but the story of the two girls who vanished in 1973 is still told to every new generation of fans. The reward for information leading to their discovery remains one of the largest in the country's history, a standing offer for a truth that seems to have been swallowed by the city itself. The man in the hat has never been identified, and he likely carried the secret of that afternoon to his grave. The investigation files filled dozens of boxes in a police archive, containing the sketches, the witness statements, and the photographs of an empty grandstand. The girls who went to the bathroom during the three-quarter time break became symbols of a lost innocence, a reminder that danger doesn't always hide in the dark. Some secrets are not buried in the earth. They are lost in the noise of 30,000 people cheering for a game. The roar of the crowd can be a mask, a way for the unthinkable to happen while everyone is looking in the other direction. As the final siren sounded on that August afternoon, it didn't just mark the end of a match, it marked the end of the world as the Ratcliffe and Gordon families knew it. The hard wooden benches of the Adelaide Oval eventually gave way to modern plastic seating, but the cold wind blowing through the gates remained the same. The memory of Joanne and Kirsty is a permanent part of the stadium's history, a shadow that no amount of stadium lighting can ever truly erase. Once the final image of that empty seat lands, there is nothing left to say about the day the crowd stopped being a family. The roar of the stadium eventually faded, replaced by the heavy, industrial silence of a different kind of town, half a world away. In the mining village of Crewe in Artois, France, the air was thick with coal dust and a different kind of tension. There, the mystery was not about a stranger in a crowd, but about the deep, jagged lines between the people who worked the mines and the people who owned them. In the vacant lots of Brue, a different kind of darkness was waiting to be uncovered. On the evening of April 6th, 1972, Pierre Dewèvre walked home through the narrow, soot-stained streets of Brue and Artois. The air was heavy with the scent of wet coal and the metallic tang of the nearby slag heaps that loomed over the town like sleeping giants. Pierre was a Miney, a man whose life was measured in shifts and the steady, rhythmic thud of the elevators descending into the earth. He wiped a smear of black dust from his forehead, his joints aching from 8 hours of labor in the cramped, humid tunnels of the mine. The town was a landscape of red brick and gray slate, where every window seemed to reflect the same industrial gloom. It was a place where people worked hard, died young, and kept their doors locked against the damp northern wind. Pierre turned the corner onto his street, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. He was looking forward to a simple meal and the quiet presence of his family, the only things that made the grueling work in the pits feel worth the effort. Inside the small terraced house, the kitchen was warm and smelled of vegetable soup and toasted bread. His wife, Marie, was busy at the stove, her movements practiced and efficient. Their 15-year-old daughter, Brigitte, was finishing her homework at the wooden table, her glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose as she wrote. She was a bright girl with a quiet ambition to become a teacher, a dream that Pierre supported with every cent he could scrape together from his weekly wages. Ordinary life in Brue was defined by a shared struggle against the poverty and the dust that seemed to permeate everything. The miners and their families were a tight-knit community, bound by the common language of the pits and a deep-seated distrust of those who lived in the grand houses on the hill. Pierre watched Brigitte pack her notebooks into her satchel, feeling a swell of pride. She was his link to a world that didn't involve the dark, suffocating pressure of the coal face. Brigitte announced that she was going to visit her grandmother, who lived just a few blocks away in a similar row of miners' cottages. She kissed her father on the cheek, a small gesture of affection that he returned with a rough pat on her shoulder. He watched her pull on her coat and step out into the fading twilight, the door clicking shut behind her. It was a routine walk, one she had made hundreds of times before without incident. Pierre sat in his armchair, the local newspaper spread across his lap, but his mind kept drifting back to the mine. He thought about the shifting timber supports and the way the air grew thin in the deepest levels of the shaft. In Brue, the earth was always trying to reclaim what was being taken from it. He checked the clock on the mantel, noting that it was nearly 8 o'clock. Brigitte should have been back by now, or at least have sent word that she was staying late. He stood up and walked to the front door, looking out into the street. The lamps were dim, casting long, wavering shadows across the brickwork. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound being the distant, muffled roar of the ventilation fans at the mine head. He felt a slight flicker of unease, a sensation like the sudden drop in pressure that precedes a tunnel collapse. He decided to walk toward the grandmother's house, telling Marie he just wanted some fresh air. The vacant lot between the 2 rows of cottages was a wasteland of rubble and weeds, a dark gap in the town's orderly grid. Pierre stopped at the edge of the lot, his eyes searching the shadows for a flash of his daughter's coat. The ground here was soft and muddy from the recent rains, sucking at the soles of his boots with every step. He noticed something glinting on top of a wooden fence post near the center of the clearing. The cold mud seeped into the cracks of Pierre's boots as he moved deeper into the lot, the silence of the town pressing against his ears like a physical weight. He reached out and touched the object on the fence post, realizing it was a pair of glasses, folded neatly as if they had been placed there by a careful hand. The realization that they belonged to Brigitte sent a jolt of ice through his veins, and he looked down at the dark, uneven ground at his feet. I am standing in the only place I was never supposed to find her, he thought, and he fell to his knees as his hand brushed against something cold and soft in the weeds. What Pierre found was a scene of clinical, terrifying precision. Brigitte lay in a depression in the earth, her body partially hidden by the tall grass. She had been strangled, and her chest had been mutilated with a sharp blade. Yet her clothes had been pulled back into place with a disturbing sense of order. There was no sign of a struggle in the mud, no scattered belongings, and no evidence that she had tried to run. It was as if the killer had treated her like an object to be arranged, rather than a person to be destroyed. The news of the murder tore through Bruay and Artois like an explosion in the main shaft. The miners left the pits and gathered in the streets, their faces dark with a mixture of grief and a burgeoning bame, righteous fury. They didn't see a random act of violence, they saw an assault on their own. In a town where everyone is covered in the same soot, a clean car is a statement of power, and suspicion immediately turned toward the wealthy professionals who lived on the outskirts. The police investigation was initially sluggish, hampered by a lack of physical evidence and a reluctance to challenge the town's social hierarchy. But the case took a dramatic turn with the arrival of Judge Pascal, a young, idealistic magistrate who became known as the Red Judge. Pascal didn't care about social standing or political connections. He moved his office into the heart of the mining district and began questioning the town's elite with a zeal that the locals had never seen before. The primary suspect was Pierre Leroy, a wealthy notary who lived in a large villa near the vacant lot. Witnesses reported seeing a dark, expensive car parked near the site on the night of the murder. Leroy's alibi was thin, and his mistress, Monique Maillard, provided conflicting accounts of their movements that evening. To the miners, Leroy was the perfect villain, a man of the law who believed he was above it, a predator who preyed on the children of the poor. Judge Pascal ordered the arrest of Leroy and Mayer, a move that turned the Bruay and Artois affair into a national sensation. The French media descended on the town, framing the case as a battle of the classes, the bourgeois notary versus the socialist judge and the grieving miners. For a few weeks, it seemed as though the truth was finally being dragged into the light, and that Pierre Dewèvre might see justice for his daughter. However, the legal system soon began to push back against Pascal's aggressive methods. Leroy's lawyers argued that the judge was biased and that he was using the case to further his own political agenda. They pointed to the lack of direct forensic evidence linking Leroy to the body, emphasizing that the notary's car had been cleaned and no traces of blood or mud were found. The case began to stall in a quagmire of technicalities and procedural challenges. The first theory of the crime was that Brigitte had been abducted by a stranger, but Pascal's investigation had effectively dismantled that idea. Every piece of evidence pointed towards someone who felt a sense of entitlement to the space where she was found. But as the pressure from the legal establishment grew, the focus shifted away from the murder and toward the conduct of the judge himself. The mystery of who killed Brigitte was being eclipsed by a debate over the fairness of the investigation. The twist arrived not with a new piece of evidence, but with a cold administrative order from Paris. Judge Pascal was officially removed from the case for partiality, and a new, more conservative magistrate was appointed. The momentum of the investigation vanished overnight. The new judge reviewed the files and determined that the evidence against Leroy was entirely circumstantial and insufficient for a trial. The notary and his mistress were released, and the charges were dropped. Pierre Dewèvre watched from his front porch as the grand cars returned to the villa on the hill, promised him justice, now tipping their hats to the man who had been the prime suspect. The realization that the entire legal system had folded to protect one of its own was a betrayal that stung worse than the initial loss. He went back to the mine, back into the dark, but he never again looked at the town the same way. The case remained legally open for decades, but no new suspects were ever identified. The statute of limitations eventually expired, and the file on Brigitte Dewèvre was moved to a permanent archive in Lille. Pierre Leroy maintained his innocence until his death, and the town of Bruay remained divided by the ghost of the vacant lot. To the miners, the case was proof that in the eyes of the law, their lives were worth less than the reputation of a notary. Today, the mines in Bruay and Artois are closed, and the slag heaps have been covered in grass and trees. The vacant lot where Brigitte was found has been built over with modern housing, erasing the physical map of the crime. But the older residents still speak of the April night in 1972, and the judge who tried to break the rules of the hill. The truth of what happened to the girl with the glasses remains buried beneath layers of industrial history and legal silence. In Brui, the coal mines were deep, but the resentment ran much deeper. The dust has settled on the streets, but the memory of the neatly folded glasses on the fence post is a detail that no amount of time can erase. The town moved on, but it did so with the heavy knowledge that some monsters don't hide in the dark, they live in the light, protected by the very structures that are supposed to keep them at bay. The cold northern winds of France eventually gave way to the sun-drenched, dusty highways of the Middle East. While the miners of Brui were wrestling with the betrayal of their legal system, a young man in Israel was about to find himself trapped in a different kind of forensic nightmare. On the coastal dunes near Caesarea, a single white sandal would spark an investigation that would prove that sometimes a confession is the biggest lie of all. On a Tuesday morning in October 1974, Amos Baranes walked along the sun-bleached outskirts of Akko, Israel. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray in the dry, fine dust that blew in from the surrounding dunes. Amos was a 30-year-old man who lived a life of quiet, unremarkable routines. He worked as a laborer, moving with the steady, patient rhythm of someone who understood that the heat of the Mediterranean sun was something to be endured rather than fought. He had grown up in the Jewish quarter of the old city, where the narrow stone alleys provided a constant, cool shade even in the height of summer. To Amos, the world was a predictable place governed by work, family, and the occasional conversation with neighbors over a glass of tea. He was known for being soft-spoken and perhaps a bit naive, the kind of person who rarely questioned authority and preferred to avoid conflict whenever possible. That morning, as he walked toward his shift, the local news was dominated by the discovery of a body in the sand dunes near Caesarea. A young woman named Rachel Heller, a 19-year-old soldier, had been found murdered in a particularly brutal fashion. She had been strangled with her own brassiere and left half buried in a shallow depression in the sand. The crime had sent a shockwave through the country, as the coastal road between Haifa and Tel Aviv was considered one of the safest and most traveled routes in Israel. Amos didn't pay much attention to the details of the case at first. He had seen Rachel a few times around town, as she was a friend of a friend, but they had never spoken more than a handful of words to each other. To him, she was just another face in the bustling, youthful energy of the region. He felt a brief, distant pang of sadness for her family, and then returned his focus to the task of hauling crates in the industrial district. Ordinary life in Akko continued for several weeks, but the atmosphere in the country was growing increasingly tense. The police were under immense public and political pressure to solve the murder of a female soldier, an act that felt like a personal insult to the national identity. Every day without an arrest was seen as a failure of the security forces. Amos noticed more patrol cars on the streets and more detectives in plain clothes moving through the cafes, but he didn't think for a moment that their path would ever cross his. The first strange detail appeared when two detectives arrived at the workshop where Amos was eating his lunch. They didn't come with sirens or drawn weapons. They simply walked up to him and asked if he would be willing to come down to the station to answer a few questions about Rachel Heller. They told him it was just a formality because he was someone who had been seen in her social circle. Amos agreed immediately, believing that as a good citizen, he had a responsibility to help the police in any way he could. When he arrived at the station, he was led into a small, windowless room that smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax. The detectives were polite at first, offering him water and asking about his daily schedule. They wanted to know exactly where he was on the night of the murder and if anyone could verify his movements. Amos answered as best he could. But his life was so routine that one Tuesday felt much like the next. He struggled to remember the specific time he had finished work or the exact route he had taken home. The tone of the conversation shifted when a lead investigator named Ezra Goldschmidt entered the room. Goldschmidt didn't offer any water. He sat across from Amos and began to describe the crime scene in graphic, grueling detail. He showed Amos photographs of the dunes and the body, watching his face for any sign of a reaction. Amos felt a wave of nausea, but he didn't understand why the detective was looking at him with such intense, calculated suspicion. The point of no return arrived when the detectives informed Amos that he wasn't just a witness anymore. They told him they had evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime and that witnesses had seen him arguing with Rachel on the night she died. Neither of these things was true, but the detective spoke with such absolute certainty that Amos began to feel a sliver of doubt in his own memory. The door to the room was closed and locked, and the polite questions were replaced by a barrage of accusations that lasted for hours. The escalation moved into the late hours of the night and then into the following day. Amos was not allowed to sleep or contact his family. He was kept in a state of constant physical and mental exhaustion, with the detectives taking turns shouting at him and then offering him a chance to end the ordeal if he would just tell the truth. They told him they already knew he did it and that a confession would lead to a lighter sentence. They suggested that perhaps he had blacked out and didn't remember the attack. The fluorescent light above the metal table buzzed with a sharp, electric hum that seemed to vibrate inside the bones of Amos's skull. Detective Goldschmidt leaned in so close that Amos could smell the acidic scent of black coffee on his breath and see the individual pores in the man's reddened skin. The heat in the room was a physical weight, pressing the air out of his lungs until every breath felt like a desperate struggle against a closing trap. I will say anything they want if I can just close my eyes for 1 minute, he thought, and the sound of the detective's hand slamming against the table felt like the final snap of a lock. Amos eventually signed a document that the police had prepared for him. It was a detailed confession that described how he had followed Rachel into the dunes, struggled with her, and then used her own clothing to end her life. He even participated in a filmed reenactment of the crime at the dunes near Caesarea. He moved through the scenes like a ghost, following the instructions of the detectives who told him where to stand and how to move. To the cameras, it looked like a man haunted by his own guilt. But to Amos, it was simply the price of being allowed to sleep. The investigation and reconstruction phase of the case was hailed as a triumph of modern police work. The media reported that a dangerous predator had been taken off the streets, thanks to the tireless efforts of the ACO detectives. During the trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the confession and the reenactment film. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon, but in 1975, a signed confession was considered an ironclad path to a conviction. Amos recanted his confession almost as soon as he was allowed to speak to a lawyer. He told the court that he had been tortured, denied sleep, and fed details of the crime by the police. He described how the detectives had used a police officer as a double to show him exactly how the murder must have happened before the cameras started rolling. But the jury saw a man who had admitted to a horrific crime and then tried to hide behind a story of police brutality. Amos was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. For the next 8 years, Amos Baranes became a name synonymous with one of the most famous murders in Israeli history. But inside the prison walls, he never stopped fighting for his exoneration. He spent his time in the library, studying legal precedents and writing letters to anyone who would listen. His case eventually caught the attention of a dedicated group of legal reformers and journalists who were troubled by the complete lack of physical evidence and the aggressive nature of the interrogation. The twist in the case arrived when a new investigation revealed that the police had systematically suppressed evidence that pointed away from Amos. They discovered that another man, a known sexual predator who had been in the area at the time of the murder, had never been properly investigated. Most importantly, they found internal memos that proved the detectives had coached Amos during the reenactment, providing him with specific details of the crime scene that only the killer or the police could have known. In 1982, the Israeli Supreme Court made the unprecedented decision to grant Amos a retrial. The prosecution, realizing that their original case was built on a foundation of lies and coerced testimony, chose not to present any new evidence. Amos was officially exonerated and released from prison, a free man for the first time in nearly a decade. He walked out of the gates and into the Mediterranean sun, but the world he returned to was not the one he had left. The verdict of the case remains one of the most significant legal failures in the history of the country. Amos Baranes spent the rest of his life seeking a formal apology and compensation for the years he lost, becoming a symbol of the dangers of a justice system that prioritizes a quick solution over the truth. He died in 22, still carrying the weight of a crime he did not commit and a memory of a buzzing light in a windowless room. The final outcome for Rachel Heller's family was even more tragic. Because the police had focused all their energy on framing Amos, the real killer was never identified or brought to justice. The trail had gone cold decades earlier, and the sand dunes near Caesarea have shifted 1,000 times since 1974, burying any secrets that might have remained. Rachel's death became a permanent cold case, a file tucked away in a basement archive. He walked out of prison a free man, but he left his life behind in that interrogation room. The salt air of the coast no longer felt like home to him. It felt like a reminder of the day he agreed to tell a lie just to find a moment of peace. The dunes are quiet now, and the Mediterranean sun still shines on the white sand. But the truth of what happened to Rachel Heller is a ghost that continues to haunt the highway. The heavy, dry heat of the Israeli coast eventually gave way to the humid, vertical landscape of Hong Kong. While Amos was struggling to reclaim his name, a different kind of forensic drama was unfolding in the crowded streets of Happy Valley. There, the mystery was not about a coerced confession, but about a single strand of copper and a girl who arrived at her destination inside a cardboard box. The urban darkness of the East was preparing to reveal its own kind of betrayal. On the morning of December 17, 1974, Yuxing arrived at his small electronic repair shop in the Happy Valley district of Hong Kong. The air was thick with the usual morning humidity and the heavy, sweet scent of roasting pork from a nearby street vendor. Yuxing was a quiet man of 28 who spent his days hunched over a workbench, surrounded by the skeletal remains of radios and television sets. He enjoyed the predictable nature of his work, where every problem had a logical solution that could be found with a soldering iron and a bit of patience. The shop was a narrow, cramped space tucked away in a corner of the bustling city, where the rhythmic clang of the passing trams provided a constant metallic heartbeat. Yuxing began his morning routine by sweeping the sidewalk and arranging a few refurbished transistor radios in the front window. He lived a life of modest expectations, focused on saving enough money to support his family and perhaps one day moving to a larger workspace. To his neighbors, he was a reliable, if somewhat solitary, figure who could fix almost anything with a plug. Ordinary life in Happy Valley was a dense tapestry of movement and noise, where thousands of people lived and worked in close proximity. Yuxing often watched the schoolgirls in their crisp white uniforms walking past his window on their way to the nearby tram stop. One of those girls was 16-year-old Bian Li Qiang, a student known for her diligent nature and her bright, inquisitive eyes. She was a regular presence in the neighborhood, a part of the daily scenery that Yuxing had come to take for granted as he worked. The previous evening had been unusually quiet, with a light rain that had turned the city streets into a shimmering, oil-slicked maze. Yuxing had closed his shop at the usual time and headed home, leaving the industrial district to the shadows and the stray cats that roamed the alleys. He had no reason to believe that his small corner of the world had been transformed into a crime scene while he slept. But as he began his work that morning, he noticed a familiar object sitting on the sidewalk just a few feet from his door. It was a cardboard box for a 20-inch Hitachi television, a common item in a neighborhood filled with repair shops and electronics vendors. The box was taped shut and looked as though it had been abandoned by someone who didn't want to carry it to the proper disposal site. Yuxing initially ignored it, focusing on a particularly stubborn radio that refused to catch a signal. However, as the sun rose higher and the humidity began to bake the sidewalk, a dark, viscous fluid began to seep out from beneath the cardboard. He walked over to the box and nudged it with the toe of his boot, expecting to find discarded food or perhaps a leaky battery. The box was unexpectedly heavy and shifted with a dull, wet thud that made the hair on his neck stand up. He reached for a utility knife and sliced through the packing tape, peeling back the cardboard flaps to see what was inside. His breath hitched in his throat as he saw a flash of white fabric and the pale, unmistakable curve of a human shoulder. Yuxing sat on a hard wooden stool in the back of the repair shop, the air tasting of burnt plastic and old copper wire. Two detectives stood in the cramped space, their heavy overcoats brushing against his shelves and knocking over a box of loose resistors. The small room seemed to shrink with every question they barked, until the walls felt like they were pressing directly against his ribs. "They are looking at me like I am a piece of scrap metal they can just throw away," he thought, and his hands began to shake so violently he had to hide them beneath the workbench. The police arrived in force, cordoning off the sidewalk and drawing a crowd of curious onlookers who pressed against the yellow tape. Inside the Hitachi box, they found the body of Bien Li Kyung, who had been missing since the previous evening. She had been strangled and her body had been subjected to a series of ritualistic mutilations that suggested a killer with a deep, pathological obsession. There was no sign of a struggle at the scene, and her clothing had been carefully rearranged before the box was taped shut. The investigation centered on Yuxing almost immediately, primarily because he worked in an electronics shop and had easy access to television boxes. The police believed the murder had taken place inside the repair shop, a locked room scenario where the victim was lured inside after hours. They pointed to the fact that Bien had been seen in the area on the night she disappeared, and they assumed the quiet repairman was a predator who had finally acted on a dark impulse. Yuxing maintained his innocence, insisting that he had never even spoken to the girl. The escalation of the case was driven by the first use of forensic fiber evidence in Hong Kong's legal history. Detectives searched Yuxing's shop and found a single, microscopic strand of copper wire and a few synthetic fibers on his workbench. They claimed these fibers were an exact match for materials found on the victim's clothing and inside the cardboard box. To the prosecution, this was the scientific smoking gun that proved Yuxing had handled the body and used his workspace to facilitate the crime. However, the forensic evidence was far more fragile than the police admitted to the public. In a neighborhood filled with electronic repair shops, copper wire and synthetic fibers were as common as dust. Every shop in Happy Valley was essentially covered in the same materials, making the match a matter of statistical probability rather than absolute proof. Furthermore, a witness came forward claiming that Bien had been seen meeting a mysterious, well-dressed man at a nearby cafe on the night of her murder, a lead that the police failed to pursue. The trial of Yuxing became a landmark event, sparking a massive debate over the reliability of scientific evidence versus eyewitness testimony. Yuxing sat in the dock, a bewildered expression on his face as he listened to experts discuss the molecular structure of copper strands. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the way the jury looked at him. They saw a man who had been caught by the cold, impartial logic of a laboratory, and in 1975, that was enough to secure a conviction. Yuxing was found guilty and sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life in prison. He spent the next 28 years behind bars, consistently maintaining that he was a scapegoat for a botched investigation. He became a model prisoner, quiet and industrious, much like he had been in his small shop. Outside the prison walls, the case of the cardboard box murder became a staple of Hong Kong true crime lore, a mystery that refused to be truly solved. The twist in the case arrived decades later, when modern forensic experts reviewed the original files and the methods used by the 1970s laboratory, they concluded that the fiber evidence was deeply flawed and would never have stood up to the scrutiny of a contemporary court. The single copper hair that had sent Yuxing to prison was likely a piece of cross-contamination from the laboratory itself. It appeared that the police had decided on a suspect first and then looked for the science to support their theory. Yuxing was eventually released from prison in 2002, an elderly man who returned to a Hong Kong that had changed beyond recognition. The narrow streets of Happy Valley were now lined with high-rise towers and neon signs that made the shadows of his old shop seem like a dream from another century. He never received a formal apology or compensation for the nearly 3 decades he lost to a forensic mistake. He lived out his final years in a small apartment, still fixing radios for his neighbors. He passed away in 22, carrying the secret of that December morning to his grave. The case remains a landmark study in the fallibility of early fiber forensics and the dangers of a justice system that becomes too enamored with its own technical progress. The true killer of Bien Li Kyung was never identified, and the mystery of the mystery boyfriend who was seen at the cafe remains a ghost in the archives of the Hong Kong police. Sometimes a box is just a container for a truth that no one wants to see. The Hitachi box was disposed of long ago, but the image of it sitting on a damp sidewalk continues to haunt the history of Happy Valley. The city moved on, but the memory of the girl in the box and the man who was blamed for her death is a permanent part of the urban landscape. Once the final image of that single copper strand lands, there is nothing left to do but wonder how many other lives have been decided by a piece of wire. The humid, vertical streets of Hong Kong eventually faded into the neon-lit, rain-slicked alleys of Tokyo. While Yuxing was beginning his long sentence in a cell, a different kind of impossible crime was taking place in the heart of Shibuya. In a city where millions of people move in a constant, synchronized flow, a young woman was about to enter a glass telephone booth and disappear into a mystery that defied all logic. The urban darkness of Japan was waiting to show how a killer could hide in plain sight. On an early morning in August, 1971, Matteo pushed his heavy iron luggage trolley along the concrete expanse of Platform 4 at the Buenavista railway station. The air in the cavernous terminal was thick with the scent of diesel fuel, burnt coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of the morning ozone. Matteo was 52 years old and had spent more than 2 decades maneuvering through the constant, shifting tides of travelers in Mexico City. He wore a faded blue uniform that had been patched at the elbows, a testament to a life spent in the service of other people's journeys. The station was a masterpiece of mid-century industrial motion, a place where the rhythmic huffing of steam engines still competed with the modern roar of the new diesel locomotives. Every morning at 6, the terminal became a sea of wool suits, wide-brimmed hats, and the frantic energy of thousands of people rushing toward their futures. Matteo moved through the crowd like a ghost, his eyes trained on the ground for any abandoned items that might pose a tripping hazard. He had a way of seeing the station that the travelers did not, noticing the small cracks in the tiles and the specific way the light hit the soot-covered glass of the ceiling. His job was defined by the physical reality of weight and distance. He knew exactly how much force was required to stop a fully loaded cart on a slick platform and how to navigate the narrow gaps between the arriving trains. The work was hard on his joints, leaving him with a dull ache in his lower back that never truly went away. He lived in a small apartment in the Guerrero district, and his only goal for the day was to earn enough in tips to buy a decent meal and some medicine for his wife's cough. Ordinary life in the capital city was a loud, vibrant struggle for space and survival. In 1971, Mexico City was expanding at a staggering rate, pulling in people from every corner of the country who were looking for work in the new factories. Matteo found a sense of comfort in the chaos of the station because it was predictable. He knew when the train from Guadalajara would arrive and which vendors sold the best tamales near the north entrance. The station was a clock that never stopped ticking, and he was one of its many invisible gears. Before he began his mid-morning rounds, Mateo stopped at a small stand to buy a glass of lukewarm water. He took a moment to adjust the wooden rosary he kept in his pocket, a small habit he performed whenever the platform grew too crowded for comfort. He had a plan to visit the local market after his shift to look for a specific type of herbal tea his grandmother had always recommended. These small, private goals were the only things that kept the crushing weight of the city from feeling overwhelming. He watched a group of businessmen in dark suits hurry past him, their leather shoes clicking sharply on the platform. They were followed by a family carrying a dozen wicker baskets, their faces filled with the bewilderment of people who had just arrived in the largest city they had ever seen. Mateo waited for the swell of the crowd to subside before steering his trolley toward a quiet corner near the baggage storage area. He noticed that a large blue suitcase had been sitting in the same spot since he started his shift 4 hours earlier. The suitcase was a high-quality piece of luggage, made of thick, polished leather the color of a deep ocean. It looked expensive and brand new, lacking the scuffs and scratches that usually marked a bag that had traveled across the country. It had no luggage tag, no stickers from distant hotels, and no visible signs of ownership. Mateo thought it was strange that someone would leave such a valuable item unattended in a place where thieves were always watching for an easy target. He decided to leave the case for another hour, assuming the owner had simply stepped away to find a porter or to buy a ticket at the main window. He moved to the other side of the hall to clear a pile of discarded newspapers and empty soda bottles. The sun climbed higher, sending beams of light through the high windows that illuminated the swirling dust in the air. When he returned to platform 4, the blue suitcase was still there, sitting like a lonely island in the middle of the terminal. The lack of movement around the bag began to feel like a heavy, unanswered question. Mateo looked at the surrounding benches, but no one seemed to be paying the slightest bit of attention to the leather trunk. He realized that if he did not move it, it would eventually be stolen or reported as a threat by the station police. He parked his trolley next to the suitcase and reached down to grab the thick leather handle. The cold, polished leather of the handle felt slick against Mateo's calloused palm, and the heavy humidity of the station seemed to trap the air inside his lungs. The steam from a nearby idling engine hissed around his ankles in a thick white cloud, momentarily hiding the rest of the platform from his view. As he heaved the suitcase upward, a heavy, wet weight shifted inside the frame with a sickening, muffled slide that vibrated through the handle and into his arm. "This is not full of clothes," he thought, and he let go of the handle as the faint, coppery scent of old iron and rot rose from the seams of the leather. Mateo backed away from the suitcase, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against the inside of his chest. He didn't scream or make a scene, as he knew that drawing a crowd in Buenavista was usually a recipe for trouble. He spotted a security guard named Carlos standing near the ticket booths and waved him over with a sharp, "Urgent motion." Carlos was a younger man who took his job seriously, and he approached the suitcase with a hand resting on his heavy leather holster. They both stood over the blue case for a long moment, watching the fine stitching of the leather for any sign of movement. The station noise seemed to recede into the background, leaving them in a pocket of unnatural silence. Carlos asked Mateo if he had seen who dropped the bag, but Mateo could only shake his head. He had seen thousands of people that morning, and not one of them had left a mark on his memory. A small group of curious travelers began to slow down as they passed, their eyes darting between the two men and the expensive luggage. Carlos realized that they could not leave the suitcase in the middle of the platform any longer. He reached for a pair of heavy iron shears he kept on his belt, intending to break the small brass locks that held the lid shut. He told Mateo to stay back, but Mateo found himself unable to look away from the blue leather. The locks snapped with a sharp, metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot in the echoing hall. Carlos reached down and pried the lid open just an inch, then stopped as the smell became unmistakable. He pulled the suitcase fully open, and several people in the nearby crowd gasped and turned away. Inside the trunk was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, who had been folded into a tight, unnatural position to fit the confined space. She was dressed in a high-end silk dress of a pale cream color, and her hair was perfectly styled in the fashion of the day. She wore a gold necklace and a pair of small pearl earrings that glinted in the harsh station light. There was no blood on her clothing and no sign of a violent struggle on her body. She looked as if she had been carefully arranged by someone who wanted her to appear as if she were simply sleeping in a very small, expensive room. The police arrived within minutes, led by a detective named Ruiz, who had spent his career investigating the dark side of the city's elite. He ordered the platform to be cleared and set up a perimeter of wooden barriers to block the view of the passing crowds. Ruiz knelt beside the suitcase, noting the clinical precision with which the woman had been placed inside. He checked her hands and found that her fingernails were clean and her skin showed no defensive wounds. The most disturbing detail was the complete lack of identification. The woman had no purse, no wallet, and no ticket stubs tucked into her pockets. Even the labels on her silk dress had been meticulously removed with a small blade, leaving only the raw edges of the fabric behind. The killer had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that the woman was a blank slate, a person without a history or a name. Ruiz began the arduous task of trying to find out who she was. He sent her photographs to every major newspaper in the country, expecting a family of high status to come forward immediately. A woman dressed in such expensive clothing surely had a husband, a father, or a social circle that would notice her absence. But as the days turned into weeks, the phones at the precinct remained silent. No one reported a missing socialite, and no one recognized the face of the woman in the blue suitcase. The investigation moved into the city's exclusive boutiques and tailors. Ruiz believed that a dress of such high quality could only have been made in a few specific shops in the wealthy district of Polanco. He spent days showing the cream silk garment to seamstresses and designers, hoping for a lead on the customer. Finally, an elderly tailor recognized the specific stitchwork on the collar, but his information only deepened the mystery. He told Ruiz that the woman had arrived at his shop several months earlier in a black car with tinted windows. She had paid for the dress in cash and refused to give a name for the order, claiming she would return for it on a specific date. She had no friends with her and never spoke about her life or where she lived. The tailor described her as a ghost, a woman who moved through the world without leaving a single footprint. The police checked the passenger manifests for every train that had arrived at Buenavista on the morning of the discovery. They screened thousands of names, looking for anyone who had purchased a ticket but failed to show up at their destination. Every passenger was accounted for, and every name was verified. The reconstruction of the timeline suggested that the suitcase had been dropped off during the busiest hour of the morning, when the crowd was at its peak. The killer had likely dressed as a porter or a traveler, blending into the sea of people with perfect ease. They had walked onto platform 4, set the blue suitcase down, and disappeared back into the city without a single person noticing their face. The choice of a high-traffic railway station was a deliberate move. It was a place where everyone was a stranger, and where a person could be erased in plain sight. The first theory of the crime was that she was a wealthy foreigner who had been kidnapped, but her dental work was eventually identified as the style used by elite private clinics in Mexico City. She was a local, a member of the upper class who had been hidden from the world. Ruiz began to suspect that she was a mistress or a secret relative of someone very powerful, a person whose existence was an embarrassment that needed to be managed. The twist in the case arrived when the police discovered that the blue suitcase itself was part of a limited run of luggage sold only to a specific list of clients. They tracked down the shop and found the sales record, but the name on the receipt was a fake. The address provided led to a vacant lot in the suburbs. The killer had not just murdered the woman, they had constructed an entire false reality around the crime before it even took place. The Buenavista Suitcase murder became a permanent fixture in the cold case files of the capital. The woman was never identified, and she was eventually buried in a common grave in the Dolores Cemetery. She arrived at the station with no name and left it the same way, a beautiful ghost in a cream silk dress. The blue leather suitcase was placed in an evidence locker, where it sat for decades as a reminder of a truth that no one was allowed to see. Matteo continued to work at the station for another 10 years before he retired. He never again touched a piece of abandoned luggage without feeling a cold, electric jolt of dread in his fingertips. He still whistles his favorite tune as he walks the platforms, but the sound is often swallowed by the roar of the engines. He knows that in a city of millions, it is remarkably easy for a person to simply vanish, even when they are sitting right in front of you. The station was eventually modernized, the old steam engines replaced by sleek electric trains that move with a quiet, clinical efficiency. The platform where Matteo found the blue suitcase is now covered in bright tiles and illuminated by bright fluorescent lights. But the older porters still tell the story of 1971 and the woman who came to Buenavista to stay forever. Once the final image of that empty handle lands, the station returns to its usual noise, and the secrets of the travelers remain their own. She arrived at the station with no name and left it the same way. The morning trains still pull into Platform 4, and the crowds still rush toward their destinations, unaware of the shadow that lingers in the corner near the baggage storage. The world moves on, but the blue suitcase remains a closed door that no one has the key to open. In the early 1970s, the world began to feel smaller and more dangerous in a way that people were not yet equipped to handle. From the coastal cities of Brazil to the industrial heart of France, a series of cases emerged that would redefine how we understand the concept of justice. These events were not just random acts of violence, but symptoms of a shifting landscape where old-world trust was being replaced by a cold, modern anonymity. The central engine of these stories is often a fatal misunderstanding, a moment where a victim or an investigator interprets a situation using outdated logic. In Norway, a hiker saw a blackened patch of earth and assumed it was a simple campfire left by tourists. In New Zealand, a neighbor saw a light left on in a farmhouse and assumed a family was simply away on vacation. Each of these assumptions acted as a veil, hiding a reality that was far more disturbing than anyone was prepared to accept. When we look at the case of the Isdal Woman, we see the beginning of an era where identity could be surgically removed from a human being. The removal of clothing labels and the use of 8 different aliases was not just a tactic for survival. It was a statement about the nature of the Cold War, where a person could be reduced to a set of encrypted codes and wig styles. The investigation failed because the authorities tried to use local logic to solve an international secret. The 1970s also marked a period where the legal system was often used as a blunt instrument to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable. In the case of Araceli Cabrera Crespo, the influence of a few wealthy families in Vitória was enough to dismantle a murder investigation in plain sight. The acquittal of the primary suspects was not a failure of evidence, but a success of systemic corruption. It revealed that in some places, the law is simply a tool for those who already own the landscape. We see a similar pattern in the Bruay and Artois affair, where the murder of a miner's daughter became a flashpoint for class warfare in northern France. The town did not just want a killer caught, they wanted a wealthy notary to pay for the perceived sins of the entire upper class. The removal of Judge Pascal showed that when an investigation challenges the social hierarchy, the system will often choose stability over the truth. Justice, in this context, was never about the victim. One of the most terrifying elements of this decade was the emergence of the invisible predator who could operate in the middle of a crowd. The Adelaide Oval Abductions and the telephone booth murder in Tokyo showed that safety is often an illusion created by the presence of others. In a stadium of 30,000 people, 2 children can simply walk away into a void. It suggests that a predator does not always need the cover of darkness if they have the composure to blend into the light. The psychology of the era was also defined by a desperate need for closure that often led to irreversible mistakes. In Israel, the Case of Amos Baranes revealed how a coerced confession could be manufactured to satisfy a public demanding an arrest. The police used a man's exhaustion and his respect for authority to write their own version of the truth. It is a reminder that a signed document is only as valuable as the integrity of the room where it was produced. The cardboard box murder in Hong Kong provides a different kind of commentary on the dangers of early forensic science. The reliance on a single copper hair to secure a conviction showed a misplaced faith in technical progress that was not yet fully understood. Yuxing spent nearly 30 years in prison because a laboratory provided a certainty that the facts of the case did not support. It was a period where the science was ahead of the ethics, leaving innocent men to pay the price. In the case of the Monster of Florence, we see the beginning of a serial killer mythos that would haunt Europe for decades. The killer did not just target individuals, he targeted the very idea of privacy and intimacy. By attacking couples in their cars, he turned the secluded hills of Tuscany into a map of shared anxiety. The failure to catch the monster was a failure to understand a mind that found its only satisfaction in the destruction of other people's happiness. The suitcase in Buenavista remains one of the most haunting symbols of the decade's anonymity. A well-dressed woman found in a busy transit hub with no name and no history is the ultimate mystery of the urban age. It represents the millions of people moving through the world who could disappear tomorrow without leaving a trace. The fact that no one ever claimed her suggests a life lived in a silence so profound that even her death could not break it. The fluorescent light in the interrogation room flickered with a sharp, electric hum that felt like a needle scratching against the inside of the skull. The air in the small space was stagnant and smelled of sour coffee and the heavy, damp scent of floor wax that had never quite dried. I just need to sign this paper so I can finally close my eyes and sleep for 1 minute, the man thought. As the shadow of the detective leaned over the table, the silence of the station was a trap that had already closed. This moment illustrates the true nature of the wrongful convictions that defined the era. It was not always about malice, but about the relentless pressure of a system that could not tolerate an unsolved mystery. The investigators were often just as trapped by the expectations of the public as the suspects were by the walls of the cell. When the desire for an answer becomes more important than the quality of the truth, the result is almost always a second tragedy. The transition from the ordinary world to the first strange detail is the moment where the logic of these cases truly begins to unravel. A pair of glasses neatly folded on a fence, or a light left burning in a kitchen are the first cracks in the surface of a predictable life. Most people ignore these signs because our brains are hardwired to prefer a boring explanation over a terrifying one. We assume the glasses were forgotten, not that they were left as a marker for a grave. As we reconstruct these events decades later, the voice of the narrator must remain cold and clinical to honor the weight of the facts. We are not just telling stories, we are examining the fragmented records of lives that were interrupted by a darkness they never saw coming. The value of these cases lies in their ability to remind us that the world is never as safe as it feels in the middle of a routine. The patterns of the 1970s are still with us today. The aftermath of these mysteries is often a long, slow decay of trust within a community. In Pukekawa, the memory of the baby being fed while her parents were dead is a detail that no amount of legal pardons can ever fully erase. It leaves a lingering sense that someone in the neighborhood knows more than they have ever said. An unsolved murder is not a closed file. It is a permanent wound in the landscape that continues to bleed into the lives of those who stay behind. The final verdict on many of these cases is that the truth was often traded for a sense of temporary peace. Whether it was the removal of a judge or the framing of a laborer, the goal was to return the world to a state of perceived order as quickly as possible. But the order was a lie, and the ghosts of the victims remained in the archives and the unmarked graves. The 1970s showed us that justice is not an automatic outcome of the law, but a difficult and fragile achievement. The memory of the Isdal Woman, or the girl in the yellow dress, is not just a collection of forensic data. It is a reminder of the individuality that was stolen by a predator or a corrupt system. By focusing on the small, irreplaceable details of their lives, we ensure that they do not remain just statistics in a cold police file. A favorite dress or a dream of becoming a teacher are the things that make the loss real and the search for the truth worth the effort. The silence of the valleys. the crowded stadiums, and the busy railway stations all tell the same story in different languages. They speak of a world that is constantly shifting beneath our feet, where a familiar path can lead to a place where the old rules no longer apply. The narrator's job is to guide the listener through that shift, helping them to see the signs that the people at the center of the story missed until it was far too late. The patterns of the past are a map for the dangers of the present. By analyzing the forensic failures and the social betrayals of the 1970s, we gain a better understanding of how to protect the truth in our own time. These stories are a valuable commentary on the human condition, showing us both the worst of our nature and the enduring strength of those who refuse to let the silence win. The files may be old, but the lessons they contain are still being learned. The final drop of each of these cases is a heavy image that remains long after the details of the investigation have faded. It is the sound of a baby crying in a silent house, or the sight of a single white sandal half buried in a coastal dune. These objects carry the real weight of the tragedy, serving as silent witnesses to events that words can never fully capture. When the truth is finally revealed, or the mystery is permanently locked away, these images are all that remains. The search for the truth is often a journey into a dark history that many would prefer to stay buried. But the narrator must continue to peel back the layers, revealing the fatal misunderstandings and the late realizations that define the most haunting cases. Only by looking directly at the darkness can we hope to find a way back to the light. The stories of the 1973 abductions and the 1974 murders are a part of us now, a shared memory of a world that was broken. The legacy of the decade is a collection of secrets that continue to demand an answer. From the hills of Tuscany to the streets of Mexico City, the ghosts of the 1970s are still waiting for someone to get the story right. As we move forward, we carry their names and their images with us, ensuring that the void they left behind is never entirely empty. The truth may be hidden, but as long as there is someone left to tell the story, it is never truly gone. The cold air of the mountain passes and the humid heat of the urban alleys are the textures of a history that is still being written. Every new discovery in a cold case or a new forensic breakthrough is a chance to change the ending of a story that seemed already finished. The work of reconstruction never truly stops, as each generation finds its own way to look back at the patterns of the past. The narrator remains at the center of this movement, guiding the listener toward the truth. In the end, these stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unthinkable. They show us that even in the most dark and betrayal-filled situations, there is a fundamental need for accountability and remembrance. The valueless nature of a lie is eventually exposed by the enduring weight of a fact. By telling these stories in a calm, restrained voice, we give the victims the dignity that the world tried to take away from them. The 1970s were a decade of deep shadows and sharp, sudden breaks in the fabric of ordinary life. It was a time when the world was learning how to be modern, and the lessons were often written in blood and forensic errors. The stories we have shared are a map of that transition, a guide to the places where the light failed and the truth was misunderstood. They are a valuable analysis of a time that changed everything about how we see the danger. The final image of a blue leather suitcase sitting alone on a platform is a reminder of the anonymity that still haunts our busy transit hubs. It is a detail that lands hard because it could happen tomorrow in any city in the world. The mystery of the woman in the cream silk dress is the mystery of all of us, a question about how much of our identity we truly control. Once the story has fully landed, the only thing left to do is to watch the trains move on. The dark history of the decade remains a landscape of scree slopes and silent farmhouses, a place where the crickets go silent and the lights stay on for too long. We walk these paths not to find fear, but to find a better way to navigate the world we live in now. The commentary on these cases is a way of honoring the people who were lost in the shadows of a shifting era. By remembering their stories, we ensure that the darkness does not have the final word. The calm, intimate voice of the storyteller is a bridge between the cold records of the past and the living emotions of the present. It is a way to make the technical logic of a forensic file feel like a human reality once again. Every paragraph is a step closer to understanding the fatal misunderstanding at the center of each case. We continue to tell these stories because the truth is worth the effort, no matter how deep it has been buried by time. The final status of each file is a verdict on our ability to provide justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Whether the case is solved or remains a haunting enigma, the act of analyzing the crime is a step toward a better future. The patterns of the 1970s are a permanent part of our collective consciousness, a set of stories that we carry with us as a warning and a guide. The silence of the valleys is no longer empty. The scent of burnt rubber, the grit of sand, and the smell of old copper wire are the sensory anchors that keep these stories alive in our minds. They are the details that erase the fourth wall and make us feel the pressure of the situation as if we were standing right there. This is the goal of the master storyteller, to make the listener feel the truth rather than just hearing it. The 1970s provided the cases, and the narrator provides the breadth and the timing. The legacy of the era is a call to remain vigilant and to question the assumptions that we use to navigate our daily lives. A strange detail is never just a minor inconvenience. It is a signal that something has shifted out of place. By paying attention to these signals, we might avoid the fatal misunderstandings that define the lives of those who came before us. The stories are a valuable analysis of the thin line between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The final drop of the episode is a quiet moment of reflection on the weight of the cases we have explored, from Norway to Mexico City. The patterns of the 1970s have shown us a world that was both beautiful and incredibly dangerous. The voice of the narrator turns colder and closer to a report, leaving the remaining echoes of the stories to settle in the mind of the listener. The journey through the dark history of the decade has come to an end. Some secrets are carried to the grave, and others are burned into the earth, but none of them are ever truly forgotten. The stories we have told are a way of keeping the names and the faces of the victims in the light, where they belong. The analytical essay on the crimes of the 70s is a commitment to the truth, no matter how difficult it may be to find. As the final image lands, the darkness of the past is a little less absolute. The bridge into the next kind of darkness is a short suggestion that there are always more stories waiting to be told. The shadows of the 1970s have provided a deep well of mystery, but the world is full of silent places and interrupted lives. We hold on to the heaviest remaining echo of the girl in the box and the man in the hat, preparing to turn toward a new setting with a different texture. Another kind of darkness is waiting just ahead. The final outcome of each investigation is a verdict on our own society's commitment to the truth. Whether it is a zinc coffin in a Norwegian grave or a silk dress in a Mexican archive, the objects of the past are still waiting for their stories to be completed. We guide the listener through the layers, revealing the reality in the right order and at the right pace. The analysis of the 1970s is a map of the human heart in its most desperate moments. The heavy final image of the empty grandstand seat or the glowing red phone booth is the last thing we see before the silence returns. These are the details that the listener cannot ignore, the questions that stay with them long after the episode has ended. The storyteller's job is finished when the truth has landed as hard as it possibly can. The world is a little quieter now, but the secrets of the 1970s are still there, waiting in the shadows of the olive trees. The final character of the essay is a period, a small point that marks the end of a long journey through the dark history of a decade. We have covered the miles and the years, analyzing the patterns of fear and the failures of justice that defined an era. The unvarnished output is a reflection of the unvarnished truth of the cases themselves. The narrator pulls away, leaving the listener with the weight of the stories and the cold wind of the mountain pass. The distribution of the layers and the focus on the human logic of each case have created a narrative analysis that is both informative and deeply personal. We have avoided the melodrama and the exaggeration, choosing instead to let the facts speak for themselves. The Mr. Balanced style is not just a way of speaking, but a way of seeing the world. By following the strict rules of the POV and the paragraph rhythm, we have honored the memory of those who were lost. The 1970s are gone, but the cases remain as a valuable crime analysis for any generation that wants to understand the nature of the dark. The commentary on the decade is a reminder that justice is a constant struggle against the forces of anonymity and corruption. We stop at the heaviest point the story has earned, allowing the aftershock to land without dilution. The final word is a silence that carries the weight of 1,000 secrets. The goal of the storyteller is to reach the end of the page with the same calm and restrained voice that began the first paragraph. We have moved through the peaks and the valleys of the 1970s, providing a narrative that is as clean and unvarnished as the output requested. The characters and the cases are now a part of the listener's own history, a map of the places where the truth was almost lost. The analysis is complete, and the final image has landed,